Everyone with YouTube and welcome back to a new video with Rams Fan YT. Feels a while since we've done any form of trivia or anything sort of beyond predictions and shorts, to be fair, on this channel. But this time I decided to go a bit back to my roots, and this season we've seen a campaign particularly ramp up for the National League to be getting free promotion spots and therefore invariably free relegation spots for the teams in the Football League. So what I've done is I've gone through all 42 seasons of the top flight of non-league football from when it formed as the Alliance Premier League through the conference through to the current day National League, and have seen what would happen if they gained an added extra promotion spot. So not necessarily free up, free down throughout the entirety of the time, but just an added spot. So obviously completely fabricated because it didn't happen, but we'll be interested to see how the alternative timeline would have occurred. Each one's going to be an alternative timeline as well, because I can't be juggling several plates at the same time. That would be too difficult. And by the way, if there's 2 consecutive seasons that they won the title or earned the promotion, I may choose to lump them together, as is the case with our starting example with Altrincham, who won the Alliance Premier League title both in 1979-80 and 1980-81. It would have been Rochdale relegated, actually, if Altrincham did get promoted. And I think we may have seen a mid-table season in their first season in the Football League, giving a good account of how a national non-league side could slip straight into the Football League. But very quickly, things would become difficult with a second season syndrome. They would be mired in a relegation battle in the second season, and also maybe a season after that. And the season after that, gradually becoming apparent that the height they had at the start of the decade was stagnating, with attendances starting to falling, and a brief mid-table finish in 1984-85 and 1985-86. They will slump back into relegation. And that's sort of how it ends up being for the next 20 years, either being in a relegation, scrapping, or in mid-table, occasionally challenging for the playoffs. But I do think they'll reach the third tier for the 2010-11 season, only to be relegated 2 seasons later and then bounce back up 2 seasons later. This time it will be Altrincham's best spell until the COVID decimates the club. And it is worth noting that I am going to keep things like COVID and other sort of key time frames as constant in this timeline. And they end up suffering 2 relegations in 3 seasons, ending up back in non-league for the 2023-24 season. It may be more exciting than what happened in real life, and they would certainly have a rivalry with Stockport County developing, but Altrincham would now be considered a big boy in the National League as well. Runcorn 1981-82. A club which no longer exists is Runcorn, which won the 1981-82 Alliance Premier League. And for this season, Crewe Alexandra would have been relegated from the Football League, with Runcorn taking its place. A rivalry with Tranmere Rovers would have immediately kicked off. However, I suspect they would have been relegated the very next season, as the stadium would have needed ground improvements. So this is a case of what happened with a few of them. They weren't permitted promotion because of the ground requirements. And I'm going along the rules that you sort of get in non-league, which is a 2-season grace period to get yourself up to standard. So I'm doing that in this one here. So the ground improvements would have certainly meant that they had less money to spend on players. So I think they would have almost certainly been relegated. Whether they would have survived in 2006 is another question, with them having the status of former Football League club. But my suspicions are, much like nearby club Chester City, it wouldn't have made a difference, and Runcorn still would have gone out of business. Enfield 1982-83. It would be fascinating to see if Enfield would have had the same demise if they had been in the Football League. That season would have seen Hereford United relegated, and just for clarification, every single one of these is a different simulation. Otherwise, it would have got complicated very quickly, just so I can clarify. But I suspect the Enfield side would have finished mid-table in their first season, followed by a playoff finish the season after, making suddenly the gap seem small and leading calls to do 2 up, 2 down. A bit like today, there are calls for a 3 up, 3 down system. They ultimately fail, and for the next decade have a series of mid-table finishes with occasional relegation scraps until a relegation is finalised in 1996-97. I therefore suspect that the move away from Enfield would still happen and that liquidation would still occur. However, it may have been a few years later due to at least some legacy around their former Football League status. Maidstone United in 1983-84. Maidstone would have been promoted about 6 years earlier than they were in real life, and Chester City would have been relegated this season. I reckon Maidstone would probably finish mid-table in their first season and gain promotion to the third tier a season later. I reckon maybe even a few mid-table seasons potentially challenge for the playoffs at that time in League One, and will come to establish themselves as the best side in Kent. I reckon with the 90s, much like in real life, will have a major impact on Maidstone, with them being relegated to the fourth tier in 1992-93. The season in real life they get liquidated. However, I think they managed to briefly stabilise themselves by selling their home ground and the ground sharing with Dartford. So they make an instant return to the third tier, but low attendances will mean that they were immediately relegated. And despite a couple of seasons competing for the playoffs, they then drift into mid-table and are eventually relegated back to the conference. Maidstone Invicta, who became Maidstone United in real life, became a de facto Phoenix club, and Maidstone United would be relegated to the conference in the year 2000, with Maidstone Invicta having been promoted to the Conference South the same year after a couple of seasons in mid-table. So there would have been 2 clubs. So if that's confusing what I'm saying there, in terms of Maidstone United have still got a name, but then playing in Dartford, Maidstone Invicta are playing in Maidstone and would have been promoted to Conference South the same year that Maidstone United relegated to Conference. Hope that clears that up a bit more. I've just realised how confusing that is. I think Maidstone United decide to merge with Invicta, taking back their own home ground at this point. I think this would have an immediate impact. They would reach the playoffs of the conference, followed by a title win, taking them back to the Football League for the 2003-4 season. The 4 seasons of consistently bottom half finishes and relegation in 2008-9 and the onset of a financial crash would probably see Maidstone liquidated and re-established in the Isthmian League Division 1. Wealdstone 1984-85. An often forgotten part of history is that Wealdstone could have been promoted to the Football League, and it would have also seen Torquay United relegated. Wealdstone probably would struggle to compete with the other London clubs in the nearby, particularly thinking about Tottenham and Arsenal, not that far away, and they therefore struggle with fans. And I would suspect they would be immediately relegated following the following season. And to be fair, I just suspect that the history from that point for Wealdstone does remain with what they have in real life. Enfield again emerging in 1985-86. You had another season that Enfield could have been promoted, but they weren't. And it's another season that Torquay probably should have been relegated. Enfield would arguably struggle from the similar problems Wealdstone did with Spurs and Arsenal, whereby attracting larger fan bases, and they would also be relegated after 1 season. I think this timeline, it would be worse than the other one mentioned, but probably most akin to what happened in the real time frame, with a drop-off for next season and a few seasons mid-table after that before their relocation brought insolvency to the club. Barnet won it back-to-back in 1986-87 and 1987-88. And in the 1986-87 season, the Alliance Premier League was actually renamed the Football Conference, and automatic promotion was actually first introduced. Scarborough were promoted in first place, so I've got it for second places. I can't be bothered to predict playoffs, so we're going to go with second place and then later on third place, and just assume that they won the playoffs. I think that therefore second place would be also promoted in this alternative time, which just so happens to be Barnet. Torquay would have been relegated, which honestly just seems to be a bit of a pattern at this point. Lucky scrapes for the Devon-based side. I suspect promotion for Barnet would mean an instantaneous playoff finish, as when Barnet got promoted to the Football League in real life, they also seemed immediately competitive, albeit a few seasons later. I then suspect a couple of mid-table finishes before another playoff finish, which earned them promotion to Division 3. And much like when we were promoted in 1992-93, they would be immediately relegated just this time a season earlier. They would almost be relegated again, but steady themselves and finish in the playoffs in 1993-94. This was followed up by a mid-table finish, but then relegated back to the conference in 1995-96. They had a brief resurgence in 2003-04, earning promotion back again a season before real life, and they would last a couple of seasons and then be relegated, and then promoted a couple of seasons later until being relegated back to the conference in 2012-13. The same as real life, and then I think the current timeline follows on from there. A few seasons in conference, a few seasons in the Football League, and a sort of doing a hokey-cokey between the two of them. Kettering Town could have been promoted in 1988 and 89, and I think this experiment does prove fascinating, as like a team like Kettering now look a million miles from a Football League, but there was a time when they didn't actually seem too far away. Doncaster Rovers would have been relegated in this simulation, and how different history would have been if this was the case. Kettering may well have suffered a similar problem to Rushden Diamonds, of a team from Northamptonshire that overachieved and doesn't really have the fan base to maintain the growth of the club, and overspending on a new stadium. Rockingham Road had to undergo a large transformation, and it did in real life too, becoming a Football League ground in waiting. And during the 80s, actually, they sold their lease on Rockingham Road. Now, they would have been fine initially, but when this lease ran out, they would have moved to Neame Park. Now, that's what happened in real life. Now, if they were in the Football League, they would have been unable to move to Latimer Park, as they did later on in real life. And with Neame Park being too expensive to afford the rent on, they would have been forced to either resign from the Football League and join and ground share at Northampton's ground, maybe. Or maybe they would have been wound up and a new Phoenix club was formed. I think sometimes people think of this getting into the Football League as a sort of holy grail, but actually in this alternative timeline we're seeing, it does actually have benefits sometimes not to be promoted as well. If you're having to upgrade your ground to a point which is making you go bust, forced promotion, as the FA is currently enforcing, isn't always the best idea. Barnet, again, were potentially promoted in 1989 and 90. As you can tell, Barnet was a hugely successful side during the 80s and 90s, and they would have replaced Halifax Town, in which would surely accelerate the downfall of that club. If you do want to see me do this alternative timeline thing again, just with the teams that should have been relegated, that would be also an interesting simulation maybe to do. But I do think this simulation, Barnet would have struggled more and been involved in maybe a relegation fight for a few seasons before being relegated back to the conference. Probably then spending a few years in mediocrity in the conference before returning to the Football League in 1997-98 and being relegated in 2000-2001, following their real timeline from there on in. Colchester United, 1990-91. This is our first example of a team relegated from the Football League making a return. And part of the reluctance from the Football League to accept these proposals is that they would lose historic clubs. But as we can see here, Colchester returned immediately after being relegated. Wrexham, by all rights, should have been relegated, but an increase of league size meant that they weren't in real life. And I think Colchester had early momentum and probably would have finished mid-table in their first season, and then promoted the season after. After about a decade of mid-table, occasionally pushing into playoff seasons in the third tier, they'd be relegated in 2001-2. They would have been promoted back at the first attempt, but I think will ultimately end up crashing when in reality at this time they were flying. I think they even reached a championship at one point. This is because football is all about small margins, and that failure to get to the championship football, which they did in real life, could send them on a totally different trajectory, and we could be seeing a side like Southend are currently right now in the National League. Wycombe Wanderers, 1991-92. Although this was a season before Wickham actually got promoted, I think that one season does make all the difference, as I don't think they would have achieved back-to-back promotions as they did in real life. Instead, a tough season finishing 18th in their Football League debut, but then a 7th place finish and a title win in 1994-95 would have seen them reach the second division, just not as rapidly as they may have had a bit of a knock-on effect on the pitch, and I think there'll be a bit of a yo-yoing between the two leagues before they settled down in 1996-97, where they had several seasons on mid-table to relegation scrapping seasons and were relegated in 2003-04, like in real life, and then would probably follow reality from that point onwards. Bromsgrove Rovers would have been promoted in 1992-93. The history of Bromsgrove and football is often complicated, but it would have been very interesting to see a Bromsgrove side in the Football League. This was before rivals Kidderminster Harriers reached the Football League, so Bromsgrove would have actually been the first side from Worcestershire to reach the Football League. They probably would have had a few years of bottom half to mid-table finishes and maybe even win the EFL trophy, but nothing major, and would end up relegated by 1995-96, followed by consecutive relegation, and would end up bust just like they did in real life. Kidderminster Harriers 1993-94. Kidderminster would have been promoted if it wasn't for their ground grading, and I will say for the sake of this experiment that doesn't actually matter, because later on Agborough does get Football League ground status. It would also mean Northampton Town would have been relegated to the conference, something that has never actually happened. I think they will start off average with a couple of seasons mid-table, and they will be promoted by the playoffs the season after, and continue growing, becoming quickly a Worcestershire-wide side, and the added fans will create a bounce to be in the playoffs of Division 2 the season after that. This would mean that the club view themselves as needing a ground upgrade, so will make an entirely new stadium as opposed to just improving Agborough as they did in real life. This would mean the club becomes a yo-yo club for about a decade, with a couple of seasons staying in League One, but a couple of seasons mid-table follow after being relegated in 2008-09, and they end up being relegated to the conference in 2011-12. They will win the playoffs the season after this time, actually surpassing Wrexham. However, they'll be relegated immediately and then finish mid-table in the conference before winning the conference and earning a return in 2015-16. The mid-table finish would follow yet again. They will be relegated in 2017-18, and they look to be in decline with a mid-table season for 2018-19 the conference, but then they will win the playoffs the season after this, and they would mean they'd be much better than they are now, and will probably be a yo-yoing side between the National League and League Two, as opposed to the current position they're in of yo-yoing between the National League North and National League. Macclesfield Town 1994-95. Another season where no one was actually promoted due to Macclesfield being unable to pass the Football League's ground criteria. It would also mean Exeter were relegated to the conference several years earlier, and Macclesfield would probably manage a mid-table finish in their first season, but would be relegated the season after, as much like you have now further down the pyramid. I suspect you would have been given a grace season or two to adjust the stadium to required level. This would mean Macclesfield would have to improve their ground, and this would drain finances away from the playing side and masses of debts being racked up. A couple of mid-table seasons would follow. With dwindling attendances, they were in real financial difficulties at this point, and would ultimately be double relegated and wound up years earlier than they actually were. Again, another potential case study to why opening up more promotion slots would maybe be problematic, especially if they don't have background requirements. Stevenage 1995-96. For a third season in a row, automatic qualification was banned due to ground grading, which is interesting to say, seeing Stevenage is now in League One, isn't it? But yes, they had their old ground wasn't up to standards, and Torquay would have been relegated. You can see in this simulation, and you can definitely argue that Torquay is the most lucky club. I do suspect the club will be immediately relegated as they focus on improving their ground, but will reach the playoffs the season after, but the debts racked up for ground improvements would prove disastrous, as the rebuilding of the South Stand spiraled to £600,000 in real life, and like in real life, Victor Green would probably issue a threat of winding up, And with them being relegated in 1995-96 to the Southern League, Phil Wallace decided it would maybe be too risky to purchase the club, and they would have folded in 1999-2000. Interesting news about Phil Wallace this week is he's actually increased his stake in Stevenage. Kidderminster Harriers 1996-97. Macclesfield Town were finally promoted this season, so Kidderminster Harriers would have been promoted in second. Quite interestingly, Brighton and Hove Albion would have been relegated to the conference, and there would be questions, I think, over whether they'd be in the Premier League now if that was the case. But that's maybe for another video. Do let me know in the comment section if you'd be interested in seeing that type of simulation. But I think we would see a couple of mid-table seasons, and in 1999-2000, they would earn promotion to Division 2, which would be mid-table in the third tier until 2004-05, getting relegated. What would follow is mid-table finishes in League 2 until reaching the playoffs in 2008-09. Then would drop into mid-table, but back-to-back playoff seasons until they gained automatic promotion to League 1 in 2012-13. They were challenged for playoffs in their first season, but then dropped down to mid-table in the second season and relegated in the third season, but would immediately be promoted back the following season. They would then enter the League 1 playoffs in 2017-18. What would follow is a couple of mid-table finishes, then would have back-to-back promotions, earning promotion to the Championship. Yeah, I think I've got messed that up. I think I missed out maybe a relegation. But yeah, they'll be in the Championship in 2022-23, only to be immediately relegated, but finishing the playoffs in 2024-25. Because Worcestershire doesn't have a strong side, Kidderminster definitely have the capacity to grow and support, which would have positive reactions on the pitch, is what I'm basing it off of this. Cheltenham Town 1997-98. Another season, Brighton could have been relegated to the conference, and there only being a season prior to when Cheltenham were promoted in real life, I don't think there'll be much difference between real life, and will probably finish in mid-table in 1998-99 before the Robins take on their current timeline. Kettering Town 1998-99. Unlike my previous predictions for Kettering, I think they will be a very strong side this time round, with back-to-back playoffs after they earned promotion, and would finally achieve promotion in 1991-92. They would then finish mid-table before earning automatic promotion to the Championship in 1993-94, and finishing the playoffs the season after. This seems mad, but I think promotion would bring actually new owners to the club, and I think they would probably have their peak there. They will drop down to mid-table until 1998-99, when they would be promoted to the Premier League, finishing mid-table in their first season, but they will drop back to the Championship, but would immediately return, winning the league, and they would then immediately drop back, though, to the Championship. Ahead of the 2003-04 season, the owner moved Kettering to Milton Keynes. So I think they would have probably become Milton Keynes Poppies, whereas Wimbledon has no such feint. This means that a Phoenix club would have been developed of AFC Kettering Town. Because, this was a sort of time period that someone was looking to move into MK, and it seemed more reasonable to move Kettering there, seeing we're not too far away. This would have been an absolutely catastrophic disaster for the club, as Milton Keynes Poppies, with American backers, becomes a super strong franchise, finishing mid-table in the Championship in the first season, having relocated, and then finishing in the playoffs back-to-back before automatic promotion saw them seal promotion back to the Premier League. But I suspect AFC Kettering Town would join the Isthmian League and follow the actual history of Kettering Town. In 2007-08, Milton Keynes Poppies would win the Premier League, and the following season dropped down to 8th, before reaching 6th the season after, getting Europa League football. They then have a mid-table season and are relegated in 2011-12, and then again to League 1 in 2012-13. They managed playoffs in their first season in League 1, and then dropped down to mid-table, but achieved playoffs again before achieving promotion in 2018-19, but are immediately relegated. In 2022-23, COVID ruined the club as the owners died of COVID, and so they would have been relegated to League 2, and they would finish mid-table in their first season, but gain promotion, automatic promotion in 2024-25 back to League 1. Just a little fun one that. Do you reckon Kettering, if they were at a decent enough standard, like championship level, would have potentially moved to Milton Keynes as opposed to Wimbledon? I think Wimbledon, I don't know what would have happened to Wimbledon if that wasn't the case either, because they were in a bit of financial straits at the time. It's a wacky one to think about, isn't it? Rushden and Diamonds 1999-2000. Carlisle United would have been relegated if this was the case, and Rushden Diamonds got promoted in 2001. So I very much doubt that much difference would have really occurred in reality. I suspect Rushden and Diamonds may have scraped survive in their first season and then continue on with our reality of timeline with them ultimately going bust. Yeovil Town 2000-2001. Halifax Town would have been relegated this season, and in their debut season, I expect Yeovil will be involved in a relegation battle in their first season and be relegated immediately back to the conference. In 2002-03, they would finish mid-table in the conference. In 2003-04, they would be in a relegation battle before sacking Colin Addinson. I suspect a few more relegation scrapping seasons before stabilising in 2006-07 with an 8th place finish in 2007-08. But another few relegation scrapping seasons until they have 3 seasons mid-table in a row and finish with the playoffs of the conference in 2014-15, losing the playoff finals before achieving automatic promotion the following season, before making it back-to-back promotions to League One in 2016-17. However, they'll be relegated immediately in 2017-18, and in 2018-19 they will reach the playoff final but miss out on an instant return. They'll drop down to 10th, but then have a playoff finish the season after, again missing out on earning promotion to League One in the 2021-22 campaign, but back-to-back relegations to the National League. Just for relegation back to the National League. They would be in the same league as back-to-back relegations to the National League, and then again they would be now in the National League South. I actually would suspect they'd be probably still in National League South, and the future now is actually looking much better than it would do in this alternative timeline. Dagenham and Redbridge 2001-2. Bristol Rovers would have been relegated this season, and this would arguably be much fairer than the one-up, one-down system as they had, as then the Daggers only missed out on being relegated on goal difference, and the season after they did actually introduce a second promotion slot. But in this alternative reality, I suspect they will reach the playoffs of the third division, but lose in the playoff final. But a mid-table finish will follow, with them resigning from the Football League due to unsustainable attendances for the Football League and joined the Isthmian League. In their first season in the Isthmian League, they would immediately be promoted to the Conference South, as that league was introduced in 2004-05. However, that same season, they would enter into administration for overspending the Football League. Thankfully, the fans would save the club and they would win the Conference South in 2005-06. They would finish 12th in their third season back at the conference level, and they would finish 16th in 2007-08, followed by an 11th place finish in 2008-09. However, 2009-10 would prove a bad season for the club, with them being relegated back to the Conference South. In 2010-11, they just about sneak into the Conference South playoffs, but lose the semi-finals, but would win the Conference South in 2011-12. A 12th place finish would ensue in 2012-13, followed by a 9th place finish in 2013-14. They then finished 7th in 2014-15, with things certainly looking up for the Daggers. 2015-16 was another mid-table campaign in 12th, and the slide was truly beginning, as in 2016 they would finish 18th, and in 2017-18 they finished 20th, just above the relegation zone. An inspired managerial change and heavily invested in the transfer window would see Dagenham and Redbridge sneak into 7th, and therefore I'm going to say playoffs potentially. I don't know how the playoffs will necessarily change with the change in it, but they'll fail to be promoted anyway, so maybe they just miss out. I don't know. And a disastrous 2019-20 would see them relegated to the National League South. The COVID-stricken 2020-21 saw the club finish 13th in the National League South in that abandoned season, and things became worse as wholesale changes were made of the club, seeing them finish 19th in 2021-22. But out of nowhere, they would finish 5th and therefore playoffs in 2022-23. losing in the quarterfinals. The second place would follow in 2023-24, but again losing in the playoff semi-finals. The equivalent of what would be last season would see them finish in 11th. A bit of a disappointing campaign. Morecambe 2002-3, which would have seen the introduction of saw the introduction, of 2 up, 2 down this season. So this would have been our first 3 up, 3 down one, which is what is currently being requested by the club. Carlisle United seem to be another real losers of this simulation, as they would have been relegated again in this season. Morecambe would have reached the playoffs in their first 3 seasons in Division 3, but miss out every single season. 2006-7 would see them drop off in form with a mid-table season in 14th. And in 2007-8, they would narrowly miss out on the playoffs in 8th, before slumping in 18th in 2008-9. 2009-10 would prove disastrous with them being relegated at the end of the season, proclaiming administration in summer 2010 due to the financing of the new Globe Arena, something that very nearly happened in real life. They very nearly did enter administration at that time. The conference therefore decided to come to an agreement with the club. They would have to play in the Conference North with a 10 points deduction if they were to play in the conference at all. They would be saved, thankfully for the club, and finish 10th in their first season in 2010-11 this level. In 2011-12, they were just missed out on the playoffs in 6th, but dropped back down to 13th in 2012-13, before sliding further, involved in a relegation slap in 2013-14, in finishing in 19th. 2014-15 would prove hugely successful, and as huge outsiders managed to clinch playoffs and earn promotion to the conference. However, 2015-16 saw them relegated back to the National League North. Things would get even worse as they would experience back-to-back relegations to the Northern Premier League. They would win the Northern Premier League at their first season back in this league since 1994-95. And that winning momentum continued with them finishing the playoffs in 2018-19, but would lose in the semi-finals. 2019-20 would see another playoff finish, but this time they would earn promotion to the National League. And since then to this current season would probably be a mid-table National League side. Hereford United could have been promoted in both 2003-4 and 2004-5, and would probably experience 2 to 3 League 2 mid-table seasons until 2007-8, where, much like in real life, they would earn promotion to League 1, only to be immediately relegated back to League 2. 2009-10 would be another mid-table League 2 season in 16th, and 2010-11 would see them in the League 2 playoffs, losing the semi-final before returning to League 1 in 2012-13. 2013-14 would see them immediately return to League 2, and that poor run of form coincided with the new owners coming in who actually had no interest in the club, and I don't suspect any of difference for Hereford United's demise with them folding in 2014. Grays Athletic 2005-6. Stockport County would have been relegated this season, and this would see the only time in history Grays Athletic would be in the Football League. But alas, it never happened, and it looks now that it's unlikely to ever happen. But I do suspect their first season would be a bit of a struggle in this alternative timeline, with them finishing 19th in 2006-7. 2007-8 would be their best season, finishing 10th in League 2, before finishing 19th again in 2008-9. And in 2009-10, they struggled financially, and with nearby clubs being far more popular, they finished bottom of League 2, and instead of deciding to join the conference, as would be expected, they decided to join the Isthmian League due to the financial pressures. They finished 10th in their first season in the Isthmian League, and in 2011-12, they sneaked into the playoffs in 5th, but won them, earning promotion to the Conference South, before winning that league in 2012-13 to return to the conference. They finished mid-table in their first season back in the conference, and in 2014-15, they will be relegated immediately back to the Conference South. In 2015-16, I think the club will withdraw halfway through the season, with winding up petitions served before fans would step in to take over running of the club, like in 2016 that happened in real life, just they didn't have to withdraw or have winding up petitions. So for 2016-17, they competed in the Isthmian League Division 1 North and earned 3 times consecutive promotions to compete in the National League in 2019-20, finishing 17th in a COVID-stricken National League. And then they would return to the National League South in 2020-21. They would, however, make an instant return to the National League in 21-22, only to be relegated in 2022-23 and promoted back to the National League in 2023-24. It seemed that they would become a regular yo-yo team, but the equivalent of last season in real life, they would finish 15th. That's not the equivalent of real life, sorry. I don't know what I'm talking about. They would finish 15th. So Oxford United 2006-7. An instant return to the Football League for Oxford United and would see Macclesfield Town relegated. I reckon a mid-table finish in 2007-8 and in 2008-9, they would sneak into the playoffs of League 2 and end up with them winning promotion to League 1. In their first season in League 1, they would finish mid-table in 11th. However, 2010-11 would see Oxford United relegated back to League 2. They would finish mid-table in 2011-12 before making a return to League 1 by finishing as runners-up in the 2012-13 League 2 campaign. They would then win the 2013-14 League 1 playoffs to reach the Championship, and a couple of relegation scrapping seasons would follow before being relegated back to League 1 in 2016-17. Enduring a yo-yo spell with promotions in 2017-18, 2019-20, and 21-22, with relegations in 2016-2017, 2018-19, and 2020-21. And 2022-23 seems to be a spell of break from the yo-yoing as they stayed up in the Championship, but were relegated back to League 1 in 2023-24, and the equivalent of last season in real life would see them finish in mid-table in League 1. I think we could feasibly see Oxford United maybe being a yo-yo side between League 1 and Championship. Don't know about anyone else. Cambridge United 2007-8. Chester City will be relegated this season. Whether that mean them folding earlier may be a topic for another video. In Cambridge's first season, though, back in the Football League, they would have had a tight campaign, just finishing above relegation zone in 21st, and they would, however, be relegated in 2009-10, finishing at bottom of the league. I do suspect, however, that the property developers who own the ground would actually evict them this time, forcing them to ground share with local rivals Cambridge City. But due to the City ground not fitting the conference standards, they would be forced to move into and compete in the Southern League Premier Division. In the 2010-11 Southern League campaign, they would be above relegation zone in 17th, but a very uncertain campaign altogether. Cambridge United, meanwhile, will be building at this time a new state-of-the-art stadium, and they would finish in 10th in 2011-12, and 2012-13 would have another mid-table season in 14th. 2013 would see Cambridge United move into a new stadium with a capacity of 10,000, which was far too big for the Southern League, but showed the intent of the club. But this proved financially disastrous for the club, much like when Darlington tried to move into a far too big a stadium. Although much had improved off the pitch, on the pitch was horrendous, with a relegation battle finishing 19th in 2013-14. But at least that seemed to be the bottom, as in 2014-15 saw them finish in mid-table, and 2015-16 they finished in a competitive 8th. Cambridge fans therefore went into the new season in 2016-17 with much optimism, and that was rightfully placed as they would have finished in the playoffs that season, but they would immediately drop back into mid-table in 2017-18. Another playoff finish in 2018-19, and COVID compounded the misery on the club, with seasons abandoned and huge debts to service mass sales with the masses of debts to service from the new stadium. Mass sales ensued, and a mid-table finish in 2021-22, and then in 2022-23, the decrease in standards came through, and they were relegated to the Southern League Division 1 Central for the 2023-24 season. 2024-25 would see them being mid-table in the 8th tier, with the heady days of the Football League seeming so far away, with the equivalent of last season being an 8th place finish. What could have happened if they were actually evicted and had to build that new stadium? They were also promoted in 2008-9, but I'm going to go with a slightly different alternative with this one, because I think this 2009-10 will see them instantly return. Sorry, they will be they'll instantly return to the conference in 2009-10, which again isn't great news. But in 2010-11, they'll finish in the playoffs in the conference, but lose in the playoff final. Another playoff finishing campaign would occur in 2011-12, again losing the playoff final. 2012-13 they would miss out on the playoffs narrowly, finishing in 7th. Again, I can't quite decide whether 7th place would be a playoff finishing or not in this simulation. I would suspect not. I'd suspect it'd be 3rd to 6th like it is in the rest of the current free down positions in further up the league. 2013 would yet again see them move into the new 10,000 capacity stadium, but that is far more reasonable to be competing in at the conference level, but still had a negative impact on the finances with 18th and 19th place finishes in the conference. Until 2015-16, they would reach the playoffs, but lose in the semi-finals. Another playoff finish in 2016-17 would see them reach the final, but the playoff hoodoo would continue, and they would not earn promotion in that season, but finally earn promotion in 2017-18, and then win the League 2 playoffs in 2018-19. 2019-20 would see them relegated from League 1 after only one season on a points per game basis. They would reach the League 2 playoffs in 2020-21, but narrowly miss out on them in 2021-22 before a couple of mid-table finishes, and in 2024-25 would be involved in relegation scrap, just staying up in 20th. Luton Town were promoted in both 2009-10 and 2010-11 in this simulation. I think a mid-table season of 2010-11 in League 2, if they were not promoted in the if they were promoted in the Filmer campaign, will be followed back by relegation to the conference in the 2011-12 season. 2012-13 would be a very disappointing campaign for Luton Town, finishing mid-table in the conference, but things would improve in 2013-14 as they'd be promoted in 2nd place back to League 2. A 19th place finish would occur in their first season back in the 4th tier, and a rise to mid-table in 2015-16 before being relegated back to the National League in 2016-17. 2017-18 was really disappointing as they competed in a relegation battle, finishing in 18th. This was followed by a couple of mid-table campaigns before a playoff win in 2020-21 saw them returning to the Football League. A mid-table finish in 2021-22 would occur before again being relegated back to the National League in 2022-23. They'd then have a couple of mid-table seasons in the National League, leading us to now. If it was in 2010-11, then I don't think anything really changes other than there would be no mid-table season. In the 2011-12 campaign, they would have gone straight back down to the conference. Wrexham 2011-12. I suspect initially a very successful campaign in 2012-13 as they would replace fellow Welsh side Newport County in League 2 with a playoff final finish, but would be unsuccessful. But 2013-14 would see them relegated back to the conference, and a consecutive relegation in 2014-15 would see them placed in the Conference North. 2015-16 would see them compete for the National League North playoffs in 7th, from the competition renamed. 2016-17 would see further regression, finishing at 9th in the National League North, before 2017-18 would see them relegated to the Northern Premier League. After finishing 15th in the Northern Premier League, the fans decided that them running the club was impractical for the club's ambitions, and so sought inward investment, as they did in real life. 2019-20 was disastrous, as they were last place in the COVID-thwarted season, and were thankfully reprieved. After the COVID seasons of 2021-22 saw them finish in 9th, but 2022-23 things continued to unravel, as the Hollywood owners would have invested in another club probably because there would have been too low down the pyramid, and Wrexham would have been relegated to the Northern Premier League Division 1 West after finishing 19th in 2023-24, only reprieving of a consecutive relegation due to the league expanding to 22 teams and they managed to finally get new owners and were immediately promoted back to the Northern Premier League in 2024-25. What would be the equivalent of this season in real life would probably see them challenging for the title of the Northern Premier League to return to the National League North. Kidderminster Harriers 2012-13. Kidderminster Harriers found promotion to the Football League very difficult in this timeline and were immediately relegated to the conference. In 2014-15, they would finish mid-table in the conference, ending in 12th. 2015-16, Kidderminster Harriers would be in a relegation battle, finishing 17th. And in 2016-17, they would be relegated from the National League. Harriers would then suffer another relegation in 2017-18, making it 2 relegations in as many seasons, joining the Southern League Premier Division Central. In 2018-19, they would have won that league playoffs to return to the National League North, and 2019-20 would see them finish 16th in the National League North. 2020-21 would be null and voided due to COVID, with them 12th when football ceased, and COVID would have been ruinous to the club, with 2021-22 seeing the club relegated back down to the Southern League Premier Division Central. 2022-23 would see a further relegation to the Northern Premier League Midland Division. 2023-24 would see another relegation to the Midland League, therefore a third consecutive relegation. 2024-25 would see them reach Midland League playoffs, but lose in the playoff final. Gateshead 2013-14. Gateshead will be promoted, finishing third, but I do suspect due to his poor finish will be instantly relegated back to the National League. 2015-16 will see them miss out on the playoffs in 8th, and 2016-17 would see them relegated from National League North a couple of seasons earlier than in real life. 2017-18 would see Gateshead relegated again, then a third successive relegation in 2018-19 would see them competing in the Northern Premier League Division 1 East. COVID would then abandon the next 2 seasons, and this was to be a great annoyance as a club as they would have finished third and first in the abandoned seasons. 2021-22, when they managed a full season, they would have actually reduced down to 15th. And a couple of top half finishes would follow before finishing as runners-up in 2024-25, only to lose the playoff final. Grimsby Town 2014-15. Replacing fellow coastal town Hartlepool United in League 2, I think they will have consecutive promotions as they finish 5th and win the League 2 playoffs. And in 2016-17, Grimsby would be involved in battle to stay in League 1, but would finish 18th, but only 2 points clear of a drop. 2017-18 would be an incredible one as they managed to reach the League 1 playoffs and earn promotion to the Championship. The first time that Grimsby would play in the second tier of football since 2002-03. This wouldn't last long as they would suffer relegation immediately back to League 1, finishing predictably bottom of the league. 2019-20 would see a 20th place relegation, making it consecutive relegations and League 2 football. 2020-21, much like real life, would see Grimsby relegated, making it 3 consecutive relegations, a free-fall that would see them compete yet again in the National League. 2021-22 would see them instantly return to the Football League, though, winning the playoffs. 2022-23 would see a mid-table campaign in League 2 before earning promotion to League 1 in 2023-24, only to be relegated immediately back to League 2 after only 1 season. I suspect what would be the current season would see Grimsby involved in a relegation scrap to the National League. As ever, it is always a chaotic time being a Grimsby fan, even in this alternative timeline. In 2015-16, we've got Forest Green Rovers. This would have been great for Forest Green as they would not only get promoted, but they would have taken the place of their local rivals Newport County in League 2. Forest Green Rovers' joy, however, would be short-lived as they would immediately be relegated back to the National League. A 20th place finish in the National League would see Forest Green Rovers almost having a consecutive relegation. And 2018-19 would see a mid-table finish in the National League. 2019-20 would see Forest Green Rovers top of the table, but points per game would mean they would have to settle for the playoffs, which they lost. 2020-21 was bad for the club as they were relegated to the National League South. 2021-22 would have seen Forest Green Rovers relegated again if it wasn't for the expansion of the league to 24 teams, seeing them being reprieved. 2022-23 saw some stabilisation as Rovers finished 9th, but 2023-24 would see them relegated, this time to the Southern League Premier Division South. 2024-25 would see them try and make an instant return, finishing third and therefore in the playoffs, but would stumble and lose in the playoff final. I suspect another playoff challenge would therefore be on the cards for what is now this season. Tranmere Rovers 2016-17. The first season back in League Two will be very successful and they will earn automatic promotion to League One. Another successful 2018-19 campaign will see Tranmere compete in the playoffs of League One, but don't quite get into the Championship. Unfortunately, the good times would stop as Tranmere would get relegated in 2019-20 down to League Two. 2020-21 would see Rovers finish 9th place. A 12th place finish would occur in 2021-22, before not finishing last in 2022-23, and a return to the National League. 2023-24 would be Tranmere's Rovers' worst season of all time, finishing mid-table, ending 10th place finish. However, 2024-25 saw Tranmere Rovers reach the National League playoffs and with them to earn promotion back to the Football League. For what would be this current season, which in this alternative reality would most likely mean a mid-table finish. Sutton United 2017-18. I don't think Sutton United will be as successful in the Football League as they were in real life. With a very small budget, I fully anticipate they'll be instantly relegated in 2018-19. 2019-20 was a poor season in both real life, but more so in this alternative reality, as PPG would result in Sutton being relegated to the National League South. 2020-21 didn't complete, but were 9th when the season was cancelled due to COVID. 2021-22 would see Sutton just miss off on the playoffs in 8th, but 2022-23 would be a disappointing season for the U's, as they would be relegated to the Isthmian League. A couple of mid-table seasons would follow at Tier 7, although I do suspect in this alternative reality, Sutton would be playoff challengers in what would be this season. Solihull Moors 2018-19. Macclesfield Town would have been relegated this season, so whether that would mean they would have been wound up earlier is probably again for a different video. But Solihull Moors would struggle in 2019-20, especially with the nearby teams of Coventry, Birmingham and Villa all taking more fans, and they'll be relegated immediately back to the National League. COVID had a financial impact on a club like a lot in the National League, and the points per game in 2020-21 would see them relegated as they finished bottom of the league, and due to financial problems decided to withdraw and join the Southern League Premier Division Central in 21-22. A mid-table finish ensued in their first campaign in the Southern League for the club since they had been merged, because they'd never been that low before. 22-23 would have seen them promoted and returned to the National League North, but they again struggled and were relegated in 2023-24 back to the Southern League Premier Division Central. The equivalent of last season would see the club finish mid-table, and this season would see them probably in another relegation battle. 2019-20 was Notts County would have earned promotion. Stevenage, which were a reprieve relegation in real life, would have no such luxury this season, with Morecambe receiving a reprieve due to Bury's expulsion. Notts County will struggle from a lack of fans onset by the COVID pandemic, forcing all games to be played behind closed doors, and therefore will be relegated back to the National League. 2021-22 would see Notts County enter the playoffs in 3rd place, but lose in the final after extra time. 2022-23 would see Notts County truly falling off, with mid-table campaign in 15th in the National League. They will only just avoid relegation in the National League North in 2023-24, finishing in 20th. The equivalent last season would see them return to their 15th place finish, and this season will probably be another mid-table campaign for Magpies. Our remaining sleeping giant fell into non-league. Torquay United 2020-21. Even though the fans wouldn't be able to see this, I'm sure they wouldn't care, as it would mean a return to the Football League after so long. I reckon a mid-table campaign for 2021-22, but would be relegated back to the National League in 2022-23. They would almost have back-to-back relegations, finishing 18th in 2023-24, but would then secure a return to League Two in 2024-25, and I think they'll be strong contenders for promotion to League One in 2025-26. Much, much better than where they are in real life in the National League South, 2021-22 Wrexham. I think we can all kind of predict what would happen if Wrexham got promoted a season earlier, as they would still have Hollywood investment and the same manager and all the media attention that surrounds this club. I suspect it'd be 3 promotions as many seasons, seeing Wrexham compete in the Premier League for this current season. 2022-23 Chesterfield. Chesterfield were promoted only a season earlier than in real life, and I suspect they would probably finish a similar pattern as they did in real life. Maybe would have had a playoff finish in League 2 at this point, but yeah, a decent enough team in League 2 under Poolcock. 2023-24 Barnet, and that is the 3rd club in a row which just got promoted to League 2 after they failed to do so in the previous season, and why there are now calls for a 3-up, 3-down method, I imagine. 2024-25 will most likely see a mid-table campaign for the Bees, looking to build into a playoff campaign for this current campaign. 2024-25 York City. York did a great job last season to turn around strong enough to be in the title race last season when they were relegation scrappers beforehand. And if you are regular to this channel, you will know I highly suspect York will claim a National League title this season. If they got promoted a season earlier, it would be very interesting to see if they would have stuck with Adam Hinshelwood. I suspect that would be the equivalent of this season would end in either a playoff finish or in relegation back to the National League. I can't quite tell. It's hard to judge where the ceiling this club is. I certainly think they will hit it within the next few seasons, unfortunately. So let me know about what you think in this alternative reality. I suspect it could be a bit like how the Championship now has got 3-up, 3-down. It would be absolutely ridiculous. Like, everybody will be overspending to try and get promoted to the National League. But I think it would also be good to see at the same time, some new teams, some new faces that you don't necessarily get in the Football League is always quite exciting. I just hope that it doesn't cause serious financial problems to clubs trying to gamble on it. Martin Ryan says 4-up, 4-down from the Premiership and the Championship, and League One to scrap the parachute payments. Again, an interesting simulation to do. It would be. There is proposals talked about in the Championship of potentially moving the playoffs to have a 6-team playoff, which I think is ridiculous. But yeah. Let me know what you think of my simulation down in the comments down below. And also let me know, are you in favour of 3-up, 3-down? Are you a person who thinks actually it could be financially ruinous for some of the clubs? I think it's hard to judge, and I've tried to give a bit of a balance with different clubs in this one. But yeah, I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.